Welcome to CiRCE 2015. We're with Martin Cothran here, and we're going to ask some questions about classical education. Thanks for coming.
Nice to be here.
So what is your one or two sentence definition of a classical education?
Well, classical education is an education in the liberal arts and the great books. So that's even shorter than a two-sentence definition. That's a one-sentence definition. But you can also characterize it as the old idea of education was teaching you how to think and what to do. Now, a lot of people use this expression, thinking skills and how to think, but they don't really do it. That was what the liberal arts were. They were to train you how to think. And there was a set of language skills, and there was a set of math skills, and that was the old critical thinking skills program. And that actually accomplished the purpose.
Okay, so language and math.
Language and math.
Okay, thank you. Many of our viewers feel inadequate to teach classically. How would you respond to that feeling?
Well, in one sense, Mortimer Adler once said that you can't be uplifted by something that isn't above you. So that is a challenge to parents to try to, know what it is they're actually teaching. Yeah. But that's one of the beautiful things about homeschooling in particular, is that that parents are learning along with their children. And we pass, in our state, we pass all of these adult education bills. The best adult education program is homeschooling. And actually, I think this is why a lot of homeschooling mothers homeschool, is because they're able to learn the things they never learned. So it's not a problem, it's actually a benefit.
Okay, so that inadequacy is almost a prerequisite for the best kind of learning, the best kind of education.
Right. Classical education is no harder to teach than any other. In fact, you could argue that it's easier because it's a more organized, organic system of learning. It's what true education really is. It's harder to teach false education than it is true education. Yeah. I mean, you're trying to teach the best that's been thought and said, and there's a recognized body of that material. And you're trying to teach certain skills. And if, there's a lot of programs out there. We have programs to teach Latin and math and so on. They're there, and if they're put together right, they're not difficult to teach.
So for parents and teachers who wish to teach classically themselves and have that feeling of inadequacy, which means that they are ready to do the teaching, how would you suggest that they go about that and educate themselves?
Well, I was at a conference one time, and this young man and his wife came into our booth, and they waited until everyone left our booth. And then he came up to me, and his wife was standing in the background, and he said, and he had just heard me speak on classical education. He came up and he said, "I've read 4 books." And then he stopped. I thought he was going to continue talking, and he was telling me he had only read 4 books in his entire life, that he was functionally illiterate. And he said, "What do I do?" And I said, "Read to your children." He had young children. You can start out with the most basic kinds of books. The best way to learn is to teach. So you're going to learn in the process of teaching your children. And if you feel very inadequate, start out with your preschooler or your kindergartner. Start even earlier than that if you're going to read to them. And you will learn along with them. And of course, you're older than these children and you're using basic materials, so you're going to learn faster. And just keep ahead of them a little bit if you've got a program or whatever. But teaching is learning.
And what should, if that person came up to you and said, "I've read 4 books, what should the 5th be?" What should be, so even with your preschoolers, what would you say, what should be the first books you read to your young children?
Green Eggs and Ham.
Okay.
I'm a big Dr. Seuss fan. This is the thing that we modern people have, that is the one area, I think, in which we excel the ancients and the medievals in terms of education. We have children's literature. Children's literature, we don't have children's literature. It doesn't exist until the late 19th century.
Wow.
And so we have this body of wonderful children's literature that is just magical. And I think we don't we don't think enough about really passing all of that great literature, children's literature, not the classics, not Homer,
Yeah.
and we need to do that too. We need to work toward that. But the first thing to do, the first order of business, is to read great children's classics, and we've got a fabulous body of them.
Wow, that's great. So, what, in your opinion, is the greatest of the great books, excluding the Bible?
Excluding the Bible. Well, I always say there are five.
Five, okay.
Five. And I'm going to count two as the same one because they were both written by the same author. Homer's Iliad and the Odyssey, which is the ideals of the Athenian culture, the Greeks.
Okay.
The Aeneid by Virgil, that is the ideals of the old Roman culture. And then Dante's Divine Comedy.
Okay.
That's the ideals of medieval Christian culture, and the Christian culture that subsumed the Romans and the Greeks. You didn't allow me to include the Bible, but if I was giving five rather than three, I would include the King James Bible as an English work of literature. It is the greatest English work of literature.
Okay.
And then the plays of Shakespeare, and that's what I give talks on. How to get the classical education you never had, and I say these are the five books that you need to work toward.
Okay. And so would the, following your theme, would the plays of Shakespeare represent the ideals of the English people?
Yeah, we're English people fundamentally, and we are inheritors of the Greek and Roman culture, which we're reading with Homer and Virgil. But there are great works in English. English is a very irregular language, but Elizabeth Cantor points this out, that it's the irregularities of English that give it so much versatility. And so we have a great literature, a great body of English literature, and those two are probably the greatest. And so those are things that we English people need to read.
Okay. And how would you respond to someone who says, I'm a Christian, why would we study these pre-Christian, especially pagan ideals and books of the Greeks and Romans in particular?
The Christian culture conquered the Roman and Greek cultures. And when you conquer somebody, you get to use their stuff. So this is now ours. I mean, this was thrown into the laps of the church when the Roman Empire fell, all the classical learning. We get it primarily through St. Augustine. And that was brought into the Middle Ages. It was preserved by monks. Read how the Irish saved civilization. They preserved this stuff. And they preserved it because it had truth in it. Something isn't false just because a pagan believes it. Just because a pagan discovers truth doesn't mean it isn't truth. And Augustine gives the example of the Egyptian gold. He says when the Israelites left Egypt, they were showered with gold, if you look at the account, by the Egyptians. Maybe because they had this great God who had the power to bring about these plagues on them. Whatever, they take it out into the wilderness and they do two things with it. They make the golden calf, bad thing, and then they make the vessels of the tabernacle. The vessels of the tabernacle were made out of the Egyptian gold. And his point is, this pagan learning is the Egyptian gold. It may be pagan, it's still gold.
Right, so it can be misused.
It can be misused, but it doesn't have to be.
Worship God.
Yeah, you can use it for the right thing.
Right. Well, how would you respond to another criticism I've heard, that classical education elevates the human achievements of man and they're saying this in terms of opposition to the works of God, like the Bible. So it's a pitting of the Bible to classical education. How would you respond to that?
Yeah, I mean, that's a part of this argument that humanism is the problem with education. Humanism is precisely not the problem with education. Okay. Anti-humanism is the problem with modern education. There's a good, we called people back before this century, before we had the term secular humanism, there were people called Christian humanists. Right. C.S. Lewis would be a Christian humanist. G.K. Chesterton would be a Christian humanist. J.R.R. Tolkien. They believed in humans the way the Bible believes in humans. I mean, if you look at the Genesis account, man is the thing that all creation is working up to in terms of in the creation itself. Right. Man is the highest creation. He's made in the image and likeness of God. So there's nothing wrong with the image of God.
Right.
for Christians.
Okay.
It's
So
good.
it's a distinction between Christian humanism and secular humanism, and when they think of humanism,
Yeah, when people
they're
hear that
seeing
word humanism, it's colored by the attachment of that word secular to it.
right,
But it wasn't always a dirty word, particularly with Christians. I mean, even
right.
in the Reformation, you go back and you look at Luther, Melanchthon particularly, even
Calvin.
Calvin and
Yeah.
Zwingli, they're all classically educated.
Yes.
They all actually promote classical education. Luther recommends it for the education of Germany in one of his two essays on education.
Right.
And they realized the value. I mean, Luther had in his pocket, when he died, a sort of elegy to the Aeneid. He loved the Aeneid. He actually translated and published many of Aesop's fables, which have the classical cardinal ethics in them. The reformers even loved classical education. They were all classical educators, were all classically educated. Some of them were classical educators, and they all promoted it.
Right. Yeah. When did we lose it as a society? Because that was classical education was basic to the medieval church, and we see that even coming out of the medieval church and period. When did it go away?
Classical education was education. It was the only thing anyone ever thought of education was until about the middle of the 19th century, when we have the onset of what in Leo Tolstoy's Anna Karenina, in a dinner conversation they're taking place in the 1850s, is referred to as modern education, meaning educating people to get a job, vocational instruction. And so what happens at the end of the 19th century, you have John Dewey, who has political motivations. He wants to reform society. It's otherwise called progressive, where the progressive education movement comes from. Then you have, and it's Dewey who succeeds in basically pushing out what we knew as classical education in the 1920s. In the 40s, this morphs into a vocational education, which Dewey didn't like. Dewey was for reforming culture, not for fitting a child to the culture, which is what vocational education does. But ever since then, they've been sort of together in this unholy unity, and that's what modern education is. It's changing the purpose of education from reforming culture or from fitting children to the culture, instead of passing on a culture. That's what classical education always was, what education always was. And not only now are we not passing on our culture, our educational institutions are actively undermining it.
So this will be going back to similar to the one I said, what is the greatest of the great books? What is your favorite? Let me hear. What is your favorite great book? Again, excluding the Bible.
Well, I think just in terms of pure enjoyment, probably if I can include some modern works which you would consider classics, I would say probably Tolstoy's Anna Karenina. I think Anna Karenina is the greatest Christian novel ever written, in addition to being the greatest novel ever written.
Okay, wonderful. And can you tell me a little bit more about Anna Karenina?
Yeah, Anna Karenina was actually recently made into a movie, and here you have this great Christian work, and in the movie they took the Christianity out of it, which kind of changed it. And what's interesting about that story is that Anna Karenina, it's the story of Anna and her degeneration, her moral degeneration. Anna is in a way going to hell in this story. And that's all they included. That's the part they left in the movie. What they took out was the other half of the whole purpose of the story, which was Levin and his salvation. And it's interesting because Tolstoy was not the most orthodox of Christians. But somebody said the worst Christians write the best Christian books. And it's kind of true, unfortunately. But even though his personal theology was not orthodox, his book is a thoroughly Christian book. He rises above really his own theological limitations. And it's really more, I think, Levin's story than Anna's story. And the account of him coming to a belief in God in this story is so utterly real and utterly convincing. I don't think there's anything that matches it.
If you could go to dinner with any three educators, who would they be?
Any three educators, living or ever?
ever.
Okay. Well, if I could go out to dinner with any three educators, I would want to go out to dinner with St. Thomas Aquinas, St. Augustine, and this fourth grade teacher I didn't like, who I'd really like an explanation from.
Okay. And how about living?
Living. Let's see. Living educator. Probably, I would say Tracy Lee Simmons, only I have been out to dinner with Tracy Lee Simmons.
Well, that counts. That counts.
But I'm trying to think of who else. Educators. I mean, I'm going out to dinner with educators all the time, so it's a hard. I don't even have an answer for that. I get to do it all the time. So.
Wonderful. Well, thanks. I think that wraps it up. Thank
Okay.
you so much.
All right.